revenge. For us. For us. For us.
My husband is dead. And the first people at the funeral were the ones who saw his death as an opportunity. I watched them close ranks. Then I quietly began to build the case that would stop them in their tracks. I didn't expect kindness at a funeral. I expected sorrow, empty chairs, and quiet. Instead, I found calculation waiting at the front row. They arrived with smiles that smelled like perfume and entitlement. "You'll get nothing," they said before the ink was even dry. I remember thinking, that is not grief, that is a plan. If you've ever been lied to by family, stay with me. This one changed everything. Subscribe for more stories of quiet, calculated justice. My name is Amelia Cross. I am 34 years old. I was a nurse who learned how to keep calm by practicing steady hands and gentle words. I met Ethan on a night shift in the ER when he came in after trying to help a stranger under a hooded sky. He arrived with a smashed shoulder and a grin that said he would do it all again. We built a small life, patient and ordinary. We lived in a modest house with a porch light that never seemed to go out and 2 lemon trees we nursed like promises. Mornings smelled of burnt coffee and lemon peel. His shirts still smelled faintly of motor oil from the bicycle he refused to trade in. The quilt on our bed was patched in one corner where his thumb had torn it, making space for me the first winter we moved in. Those textures, the scraped wood of the kitchen table, the worn handle of the kettle, they are the scaffolding of what we thought would last. Ethan was the kind of man who fixed radios in his spare time and left sticky notes on the fridge that said, "Don't forget lunch." He was selfless in ways that made me stop and catch my breath. The volunteer who taught kids to swim, the neighbor who shoveled the elderly man's sidewalk even when his own schedule begged him home. I remember his laugh echoing down our hallway like a light. I remember him humming while he trimmed basil. He loved with the practical tenderness of someone who showed up. We married quietly. There was cake made by friends, and a speech from his sister that included the word legacy 3 times. I loved that word for him then. I trusted that family would be family, flawed and human, but loyal when it mattered. I never imagined loyalty could be auctioned off. Ethan's parents, Margaret and Simon, were the sort of in-laws you see in polite photos, perfect curtains, private club memberships, an army of carefully trimmed hedges. Margaret's handshake felt like a winter window, polite, distant, cool to the touch. Simon preferred small talk about the stock market and subtle reminders that his son had been the responsible one in the family's eyes. There was Daniel, Ethan's younger brother, who leaned toward entitlement like a habit, a man who never learned the difference between claiming his place and demanding it. At first, the little differences didn't matter. They were the background noise of an extended family. But after the accident, the one that took Ethan, all the background notes sharpened into discord. I still remember the smell of antiseptic and coffee in that hospital room the morning they told me. I remember how the words moved, slow across the air like heavy rain. There's nothing you could have done. I remember the silence that followed, the way the ceiling became the loudest thing in the room. The funeral was a small, private thing in rain-slick pews. People said the right words. People cried. I told myself grief would be the defining thing that week. It wasn't. The defining thing came later, in the hallway outside the service, when Margaret pressed my hand and didn't speak of condolence so much as duty. Within 48 hours of the funeral, the family lawyer, a man who had known Ethan's father for years, began speaking with a tone I'd only heard in boardrooms: logistics, signatures, estate oversight. I listened politely as they arranged the reception and smiled at faded photographs. I did not know yet that they had other plans. I did not know that sympathy would be a costume for strategy. The first alarm was small, a casual question at the wake. "So, Amelia, Do you have any idea about the house arrangement? Then the longer shadow. We should review the life insurance paperwork. The forms say some things need clarifying. Voices that used to wish me well now asked about assets with the calm of accountants. I felt the floor shift under my feet in ways that had nothing to do with grief. There were signs I could have seen if my memory had been less fogged with loss. A decorative box on the side table that had always had his watch in it now sitting oddly open. A set of call logs on the phone, no one thought to hide, and a quiet impression that certain relatives were suddenly comfortable lingering in rooms that had been private before. Margaret asked gentle questions about the deeds in a way that felt like a papered probe. Ethan's policies and titles were the technical things people don't teach you to guard against. There was a life insurance policy, modest but enough to cover a mortgage and to give me breathing room. There was the house, technically in both our names, but with deeds that could be read in several different ways. There were small joint accounts and a retirement that, on paper, had beneficiaries. None of it felt like gold to me back then. It felt like the practical structure of a tomorrow I had expected to live in. When you are newly widowed, people say you need time. Time to grieve. Time to settle arrangements. I took that time. I went through the practicalities the best I could, calling banks, asking which of our documents were in both our names, making lists of passwords and accounts, pausing over signatures, as if ink could be a talisman. Each form felt like an intrusion into a life still echoing with his voice. I found one thing that anchored me. A voicemail I'd saved from his last week alive. A message he'd left while trapped in traffic, joking that he'd be late, but that he'd bring lemon pie home. It was small, but in that voice, I could still hear the man I loved. That recording would matter later. It was Margaret who first suggested a family meeting to help sort things out. Her offer sounded like kindness. She used the word we a lot. I accepted because I thought probate was easier with family involved. That was the first of dozens of practical mistakes I made because grief makes you trust how you used to trust. I wanted to believe people were decent. That meeting, held in the formal living room with heavy drapes and a silver tray of cookies, revealed another truth. Margaret talked about the house as if it were an heirloom she and Simon had loaned their son. Daniel brought up shared responsibilities. Ethan's sister Chloe looked on with that measuring gaze, as if weighing my worth in the soft light. Then there was the wrenching moment that taught me how quiet cruelty sounds when wrapped in sugar. "We only want what's right," Daniel said. "We're protecting the family." Margaret's smile never touched her eyes. I realized in a cold way that for them, this had never been purely about grief. It was about control. Their language was careful. Their intent was not. I started tracking things, not because I wanted to punish, but because I needed to know the shape of what I was facing. I wrote down who touched which belongings, and when. I made a list of keys, passwords, and notices. I asked silent questions to myself. Who benefits if the house changes hands? Who has motive to rewrite memory? The quiet house that had been our refuge felt suddenly full of onlookers. I was lucky in one respect. Ethan, practical as he was, had once said a few things aloud about how he wanted things handled if something happened to him. Small, private instructions that he spoke the night we set reminders for doctor's visits. He had told a longtime lawyer friend, a man named Victor, that if anything happened, he trusted Victor to make sure the house and his modest savings were used for my care first. That trust, casual at the time, became the single bright line I could follow. By the first month, the family had started informal pressure, talks about assistance arrangements, requests to see paperwork, polite but persistent suggestions about selling the house for practical reasons. They framed everything as helpful counsel. They never used the word take. But the effect was the same. They were moving together toward a future that did not include me at the center. I remember sitting on our porch the night before the in-laws' second visit, the lemon trees rustling like a reminder that life keeps its small mercies even when everything else shifts. I had Ethan's voicemail again in my pocket. I had a legal contacts number I'd been ashamed to call so soon. I felt raw, but a small, clear decision was forming. I would not be steamrolled. Not by grief. Not by paperwork. Not by family. That decision did not feel like vengeance. It felt like a commitment to the life Ethan and I had quietly built. It felt like fidelity to a trust. I had no idea then how much planning would be required. I only knew I would not let the house I swept every morning, the lemon tree I pruned each spring, or the recorded voice in my pocket be repackaged as someone else's gain. You see, when Ethan died, it wasn't just my husband I buried. It was the quiet rhythm of my life. People think grief comes with noise, wailing, collapsing, chaos. But mine came with silence. The kind that sits in corners and watches you forget how to breathe. The first few weeks after the funeral, everyone was kind. Margaret brought me casseroles I couldn't eat. Chloe helped me sort through condolence cards, each one feeling like a receipt for sympathy. Simon called every other night, not to ask how I was doing, but to remind me about Ethan's accounts, his investments, his unfinished responsibilities. And Daniel, the youngest, kept saying, "Don't stress yourself. Amelia, we'll handle things." It sounded comforting, until it didn't, because slowly that kindness started to curdle. Margaret began visiting less, but when she did, her eyes didn't search for how I was holding up. They scanned the house. She asked about the safe, about the trust Ethan left for the family's continuity. Daniel started dropping by unannounced, always when the lawyer wasn't around. He'd sit on the edge of Ethan's office chair, spin once, and ask, "So, have you thought about letting Dad oversee the estate for a while?" I would smile politely, pour him tea, and say I trusted the legal process. But I was already watching, because one morning, while organizing Ethan's files, I noticed the first crack. A transfer, small, almost invisible, had been made from the trust account. Not by me, not by our lawyer, and definitely not by Ethan. It was signed by Simon, and the authorization note read, "Family Maintenance Fund." I remember sitting there, staring at that line. Family maintenance. As though I were the outsider. That was when I began keeping notes. Dates. Conversations. Expressions. Every time Simon mentioned what Ethan would have wanted. Every time Margaret brought up continuity. Every time Patrick, the eldest, called from the city, pretending to check in, but always circling back to property titles. They were careful, until greed made them sloppy. I caught Daniel once in the backyard, pretending to feed the dog while taking photos of the house's exterior. For an insurance renewal, he said. 2 days later, a realtor called me asking about the property listing. Listing. My home. By the end of that month, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't a grieving widow in their eyes. I was a loose end, an obstacle between them and everything Ethan left behind. So, I started smiling more, making tea, agreeing to family dinners, letting them believe I was fragile, naive, and easily swayed. But behind every smile, I was tracing patterns, checking accounts, recording calls, learning just how deep the betrayal went, because grief had taught me silence, but betrayal taught me strategy. And by the time they realized I was no longer mourning, I had already begun building the storm that would destroy them. After that night, I didn't leave. I didn't shout. I didn't pack my bags. I just stopped showing up the same way. There is a kind of revenge that isn't loud. It arrives as absence, small, precise, deliberate. It looks like calm on the surface and is anything but that. He would hover at the doorway and say, "Are you sure you're all right?" And I would say, "I'm fine." That word became my armor. It kept them comfortable. and that comfort made them careless. The house felt different. Not empty exactly, just rearranged. Ethan's shirts still smelled faintly of his aftershave in the closet. The lemon tree on the porch gave off that sharp citrus tang when I watered it in the morning. Those details used to be constant comforts. Now, they were my anchors while I learned how to be patient. I learned to let things slide in public. I smiled at Margaret when she fussed over the curtains. I accepted hugs that felt like inventories. I nodded through Daniel's clumsy attempts at consolation. I let Patrick pray about keeping the name intact while he checked his watch. I saw them all for what they were. Not monsters, not caricatures, but ordinary people whose ordinary choices had become a betrayal. At night, I closed the door and took out the notebook I had begun keeping. It was small, leather-bound, nothing dramatic. Inside, I wrote the facts the way a nurse writes an intake. Time, symptom, action, names, dates, strange transfers, little things that, alone, might look like quirks. Together, they drew a map. There was something methodical about the way I watched. I watched how their voices softened around the word, estate. I watched how Margaret's hands lingered on the mantel when she thought no one looked. I watched the way Daniel fumbled with small bills, then tried to hide the receipt in a pile of mail. I watched Patrick's calls spike right before a family maintenance payment cleared. Observation is not the same as suspicion. Suspicion is loud. Observation is slow. It is a patience that waits for patterns to reveal themselves. And patterns eventually do. People underestimate how much people reveal when they think the story is already theirs. They let slip phrases. We're just safeguarding what's best. It's temporary, obviously. You wouldn't want the family to suffer, would you? They speak as if their phrasing will soften the theft. I remember one evening when Daniel came over with a casserole he said his mother had made. The house smelled of sage and browned onions. The casserole was lukewarm. He sat down, too close, and said, "You should consider letting the house go for a while. We could take care of it better than you could on your own." He said it like it was charity, like it was for me. I pushed the spoon around my plate, slowly. I said, "It's home. Ethan wanted it to stay in our family." My voice didn't tremble. I kept my face neutral. Inside, my hands were steady because I had my own plan building, quietly like a bridge no one else could see. Distance gave me two things: time and the illusion of weakness. They mistook my silence for surrender. That was their error. I began small, almost theatrically small. A missed family dinner. A "sorry, I'm tired" to a voicemail, a politely declined invitation. Each absence was a probe. Would they notice? Would they act? Some did. Most didn't. That told me everything I needed to know. The more I withheld, the more they revealed. Without my direct challenge, they grew bolder. Patrick started to talk about consolidating assets. Margaret mentioned selling non-essential furniture. Daniel's unease turned into impatience. His visits lengthened, and his questions sharpened. There were days I wanted to lash out. To name each theft and call them to account in the same breath I named the loss of my husband. But anger is a language they would understand too soon. I needed a different language, patient, legal, undeniable. So I built it. I found allies in quiet places. Ethan's old lawyer, who called me with a time-stamped voicemail Ethan had left months earlier asking for certain papers to be kept sealed unless a specific condition was met. An estate manager who remembered a conversation Ethan had had about protecting his widow. A housekeeper who admitted she'd noticed odd packages going out late at night. Piece by piece, the small truths built into a ledger. Distance sharpened my view. It turned gossip into evidence, casual comments into confessions. It let me see the architecture of their intent, a string of small, rationalized acts that, when strung together, became a plan. That was the moment I stopped being the one who only felt wronged and became the one who would hold them accountable. Finally, there was a night I sat on the porch and watched the lemon tree in the dark. The street light threw long, patient shadows across the walkway. In the quiet, I could hear the distant clink of silverware from a family home down the block. I thought of Ethan's voice, a recording on my phone that I'd replayed more times than I care to admit. I thought of the kettle he always left on, the thin paper of his sticky notes, the way he'd hum while tending the yard. I made myself a promise, then, not out of anger, but out of fidelity. I would not let them rewrite what he had trusted me with. I would not let the things he loved, the house, the garden, the small, ordinary rituals, be parceled out to people who saw them as assets, not memories. Distance had done its work. It had made them careless, and it had made me clear. Now, I would move from watching to acting. I kept the notebook where I could reach it from the kitchen table. A battered spiral I wrote in with the same pen Ethan used to borrow. It smelled faintly of coffee and lemon oil from the dishcloth I'd used that morning. I wasn't keeping it out of paranoia. I was keeping it out of faith that paper holds better than memory. I began to notice small things first. A soap dish moved a few inches. A pair of cufflinks missing from the dresser. The soft clink on the hallway floor that sounded like footsteps at 2 a.m. Little erasures that felt like fingers tracing where I had been. At first, I thought it was grief playing tricks. Then Mrs. Alvarez, our housekeeper, asked to speak to me alone. Her hands were rough like sandpaper, and she smelled of bleach and rosemary. "Miss Amelia," she said, voice small, "the men from the office asked me to find certain boxes in the attic. They said they needed them for inventory." Her eyes flicked to the framed photograph on my wall, Ethan laughing with his father at last year's barbecue. We gave them what they wanted. I felt a tightness behind my ribs, like the squeeze you get before you cry. I kept my voice steady. "Which men?" "Patrick and Daniel, mostly," she whispered. That answer landed like a second punch. Patrick, the eldest, had always had charm. He wore suits the way other people wear smiles. Daniel, younger but louder, liked to make a room his. Together they had goodwill in abundance. Or so they'd presented. I had always thought their small cruelties were explained away by grief or entitlement. Now they looked like planning. Over the next few days, the threads unraveled quickly. Deliveries arrived I hadn't ordered. A safe that had been in the basement for years suddenly listed as relocated in a note left on my desk. My accountant called with questions about a payment to an entity I'd never heard of. The gardener told me a man with a clipped voice had offered him extra cash for help moving things after Ethan's funeral. The gardener's hands, thick with dirt and trembling just a bit, told me the truth before his words did. I began to act the way I had been trained to act as a nurse. Observe, document, act. I set up a single camera, a small, discreet unit in the attic. I called Mia and asked whether she could recommend someone reliable and quiet. She gave me the name of Tom Hargrove, a retired PI who smelled faintly of tobacco and old books, and who had the patience of someone who'd seen too many secrets. Tom arrived with a steady gait and a bag that looked like it had stories. He listened to me, and when I finished, he said, "Only, we'll see what they show you." I liked the lack of theatrics. It suited my mood. Quiet, patient, inevitable. One night, around 11 p.m., I woke to the sound of shattering glass. A brick lay on the kitchen floor. No one outside. Just darkness and silence. A week later, my tires were slashed in the driveway. And then the calls began. Heavy breathing. No voice. Then clicks. Always around 2 a.m. Patrick had a temper. Daniel had recklessness. Together, they had stupidity. They wanted me gone. Out of the house, out of their inheritance's way. But they didn't realize I'd already gone 3 steps ahead. What the camera recorded in the following week made me glad I had not acted on impulse. Late one night, Patrick moved through the attic like a man rearranging furniture, confident, careless. He carried a box with a leather strap. When he set it down, he laughed, low and private. Daniel came up behind him, lights still off, his phone flashlight an angry thumb. They argued softly about an invoice, the kind of voice people use for family secrets. "No one will notice," Patrick said. "It's just paperwork. She's overwhelmed." The footage did not show the theft in slow motion. It showed it in daylight. Hands, faces, excuses. It showed Patrick opening a leather pouch and pulling out a watch with a yellowed tag. It showed Daniel stuffing envelopes into a bag. It showed them leaving the house with a purpose that felt like a bruise. I let the footage sit on the hard drive for a night, like someone letting a truth cool before touching it. I made copies. I labeled them. I wrote a note to myself. Don't act yet. The intimidation began after that. Not loud threats, too crude for people who like to keep appearances, but slow squeezes that let fear do the heavy lifting. A delivery left on the porch with a note. "You should not be alone right now." A late-night call again with only the sound of breathing at the other end. A framed photograph of Ethan on the mantel moved slightly to the right. A small, deliberate disturbance. Patrick and Daniel started to appear more in the house. Longer visits disguised as concern. Patrick would stand by the kitchen sink and ask about the house's utilities while his fingers traced a ledger he'd brought. Daniel would help with the gardener, always insisting on staying late. They spoke to staff in curt undertones and slid envelopes across counters like coins in a gambling game. Yet for all their bravado, they were sloppy. They used the same vendors. They repeated the same lies. They trusted habit over caution. That arrogance is a mercy to people who keep careful records. I began to thread the evidence. Tom found bank transfers with odd memos. Our financial advisor located a shell company created in the month after Ethan's accident, an entity with a name that read like a legal riddle. Mrs. Alvarez, trembling, told me about boxes of heirlooms quietly removed and sent to a storage locker in the next town. The house smelled like lemon and paper. The attic smelled like dust and someone else's greed. I did not confront them. Not yet. Instead, I leaned on what Ethan had left me. The recorded voicemail he'd left the week before the accident. He had been humming. And then he had said, "If anything ever happens to me, you look after the house. You know where the old papers are." His voice was steady. He laughed softly at some private joke. I replayed that message until the edges of his inflection were like a map. It reminded me why this mattered beyond money. Because those papers held intention. I also took action in ways that hurt men of charm. I got a lawyer who would not be impressed by suits. His name was Andrew Cole. He had been Ethan's counsel for years, and he arrived at my kitchen table with a binder of notes and a look that said he did not do drama, only facts. He told me, plainly, "We file for an emergency injunction. We freeze any transfer. We put a conservatorship on the assets pending a full forensic audit." The legal move felt surgical. I had Andrew draft an emergency motion to freeze assets and demand an accounting. He contacted the bank and the insurance company. He filed a petition that made the shell company's existence a matter of court record. 3 days later, I hosted a small memorial dinner for Ethan. I told them I wanted closure. Margaret, Ethan's mother, came dressed in black again, a fresh show of mourning. Simon, his father, barely looked me in the eyes. Patrick and Daniel joked softly in the corner, and Chloe poured wine as if it was the one thing keeping her steady. I smiled through every toast, every hollow condolence. Then, halfway through dessert, I pressed play on the TV mounted on the wall. The footage from my living room camera filled the screen. Patrick's hand in my desk drawer. Daniel whispering, "Check the safe in her closet." Their faces drained of color. Margaret's fork clattered onto the plate. Simon whispered, "What is this?" I leaned back and said calmly, "This is what you've all been doing while pretending to grieve." Patrick stood, furious. "You can't use that without consent." I interrupted. "Oh, don't worry. The police already have copies, along with the financial records from Bluewood Holdings and a little report from the IRS. The silence that followed was almost holy. Daniel tried to leave, but 2 officers, the ones I'd quietly invited, stepped out from the hallway. Patrick cursed, Margaret wept, and Simon stared at me like I was someone he didn't know. And maybe he was right, because I wasn't the same woman Ethan married, or the one who buried him. I was the one who survived his family. Over the next weeks, the pressure mounted. The in-house thefts became accusations on paper. A worker came to me in tears complaining that payroll had been mysteriously reduced. A landscaper said someone had tried to take payment under a false invoice. Daniel and Patrick's private accounts began showing transactions to vendors who had no reason to be in our life. Payments routed through the mysterious shell. The unraveling was slow and then sudden. The bank put a hold on large withdrawals. A court clerk called to confirm a hearing. The in-laws started to squint at the world the way animals do when the light changes. When the first subpoena arrived at the house, Daniel tried to rip it from the maid's hands. He was not Mario the Gentle. He was Daniel, the man who thought threats could be bouquets, and that force could be a conversation. The sheriff who delivered the subpoena had worn shoes that made no sound. He had a look that said he had seen this before. Families who thought grief was a cloak for crime. I slept poorly. I woke to the smell of lemon and the quiet hum of my grief machine, the refrigerator, the street, the world. But I slept with my eyes open in the way that people who are watching watch. My notebook filled with times and names and ledger references. Each entry was a small lighthouse. At the center of it all, I kept replaying Ethan's last unambiguous words in my head. "You look after the house." I was beginning to understand what he meant by look after. It was more than a physical act. It was stewardship, to protect, to document, to carry the intention of someone who could no longer decide. By the end of this section, the family had begun to fracture. Patrick spoke in short, sharp sentences to people who pretended not to notice how shaky his hands were. Daniel's bravado leaked out in late-night bar arguments that ended badly and were taped by security cameras at a nearby store. Simon, Ethan's father, looked older than his years when he came to the house. His tie was loose and his voice small. Margaret tried to keep the plate-spinning act of social appearances, but the china had cracks you could hear. And through it all, I moved like a person who had decided to be patient and precise. I was not naive enough to believe justice would always be immediate, but I was steady enough to ensure the evidence was there when the court and the press finally asked for it. The injunction is in place. The accounts are frozen pending audit, and Patrick and Daniel realize the house will no longer be theirs to plunder. They look at me differently now, not as a widow to be manipulated, but as an obstacle they underestimated. I closed the notebook that night, the page crammed with numbers and names, and I pressed my palm to the photograph of Ethan. For the first time since the accident, I did not feel only loss. I felt the weight of accountability. The morning the journalist called, I was watering the lemon tree. The call came from Elise Kwan, an investigative reporter with a local paper whose byline I had once admired for its rigor. She said she'd been tipped off about irregularities at the estate and asked whether I'd be willing to talk. I told her I had nothing to say, and then, after a breath, invited her to meet Andrew and Tom at the house. This was not grandstanding. It was strategy. There is a difference between shouting and letting light do the work. I wanted the light. Elise arrived with a polite disposition and a recorder. She listened to Andrew outline the court filings, to Tom describe the timestamps on the camera footage. She looked at the boxes of invoices we produced, photocopies of receipts, bank statements, storage locker contracts. She asked the questions that made men uncomfortable. Who benefited? Who signed these checks? She left with more than a soundbite. 2 days later, her piece appeared online with a headline that did not flinch. Widow alleges in-law embezzlement at local estate. Court freezes assets. The article published screenshots of the footage. Patrick in the attic, Daniel with envelopes, and a line from Ethan's recorded voicemail. "You look after the house." The reaction was immediate. Family friends called. Old acquaintances emailed. Social obligation evaporated like dew. Acquaintances retreated curiously quick. Patrick posted a statement on his feed, thin with dignity, calling the allegations shocking and untrue, while Daniel's phone flashed with angry private calls that leaked into the public sphere in the way vulnerable people's tempers do. The pressure I had built in silence now had its outlet. The bank increased its audit. The probate court expanded its review. The local police opened an investigation for alleged theft and fraud. Andrew filed the necessary documents to place a conservatorship on specific estate accounts, and the judge granted an emergency hearing within days. The discovery process pulled back curtains. Forensic accountants traced payments to a tasting room in the city where Patrick liked to host clients. Invoices for consulting that led to an LLC run by Daniel's friend. Payroll anomalies that explained why the gardener had been underpaid while a contractor named on a ledger received hefty checks. Statements from the staff, written and recorded, described how envelopes were handed off and how certain items went missing after private family visits. On the 3rd week of the exposure, a camera from a local hardware store in the next town captured Daniel and Patrick moving boxes into a van at midnight. The van had a plate that matched an entry in the shell company's receipt book. That footage was the hinge the prosecutor needed. There were moments I did not expect. Margaret collapsing in the hallway when confronted with the invoices. Simon, Ethan's father, refusing to look at Patrick when the ledger showed his signature. Chloe, who had always been quiet, breaking down and whispering, "I didn't know they'd take this far." I remember the metallic taste in my mouth. Then it was fear and vindication, and something like pity. Patrick flew into a public rage, and then into private legal counsel. Daniel threatened lawsuits, and then silence. They attempted to file a countersuit for defamation, and to argue that the subpoenas were harassment. Andrew answered with documents, with timestamps, with copies of the recorded voicemail. The law moves slowly and then fast. It is neither poetic nor fair. It is procedural. The police made an arrest after the prosecutor reviewed the evidence. Patrick and Daniel were charged with conspiracy to commit theft and fraud. The press conference outside the courthouse felt unreal. Cameras flashed like sudden white storms. Microphones crowded forward. Patrick read a statement through clenched teeth, insisting on his innocence, but his voice trembled. That tremble is a sound I will remember longer than the statements. Public shame is a slow, merciless thing. Friends who had once been regulars at our table started avoiding the neighborhood. Clients paused contracts. The oldest son of a family friend, who had always been my husband's connection to the town council, asked for a meeting and then, awkwardly, for his name to be removed from the guest list of a fundraiser Patrick had organized. In the immediate aftermath, there were practical things to do. Andrew managed the legal fallout. Tom compiled evidence in tidy binders. Mia stayed with me some nights to keep watch and bring a steady stock of chicken soup that tasted faint of thyme. I insisted on meeting the staff individually. I made sure Mrs. Alvarez and the gardener had back pay and counseling. I set up a private account to cover their needs that Andrew structured carefully so it could not be traced as a personal payoff. One of my first acts was to create a small employee relief fund seeded from the estate under court-approved oversight. The irony of creating a fund to protect people who had been cheated by my late husband's family felt bitter, and right at once, Mrs. Alvarez cried. A steady, slow rain, when I handed her the paperwork. "You shouldn't be doing this," she said. "You have lost so much." "I have not lost as much as you," I answered, and in saying it I meant every word. I had lost Ethan. They had tried to take everything else. The arrests did not fix everything. They did not erase late nights where I woke suddenly and still expected him to be there. They did not unsnap the echo of his laugh. But they did stop the drain. The conservatorship held. The shell company's accounts were frozen. The storage locker was opened in a court-ordered seizure, and there it was, an old cedar chest with Ethan's grandfather's initials, intact, the quilts we had wrapped around our first Christmas together, and papers with inked signatures proving specific bequests, and a hand-signed letter explaining intentions for the house. One documentary device that mattered more than a headline was the notarized video Will Ethan had made years earlier when we had been planning renovations. A small, informal recording where he spoke directly to camera with a cup of coffee in his hand. He had said, "If anything happens to me, I want Amelia to have the house and the garden. Not because I cannot trust the family, but because she loves it. She understands what this place is." We put a still frame of that video into the court record. Its ordinary warmth carried legal weight because it showed intention. After the headlines and the hearings, the family retreated into the kind of silence that public disgrace produces. Patrick's friends stopped returning calls. Daniel moved out of the house he'd been using as a second address. Margaret and Simon came to see me once together, frightened and smaller than any of us had seen them. "We are sorry," Margaret said, voice breaking. "We thought there were different ways." I listened, palms warm on the kitchen table, and felt the old ache that made me human. I offered no public forgiveness then. I offered a private ending. "You will face the process. That is the closest thing to justice I can offer." In the months that followed, I rebuilt with the people who mattered. I rehired some of the long-term staff who had been vulnerable to manipulation and set up transparent payroll with outside oversight. I renovated the house slowly, deliberately, not to erase memories but to protect them. I turned the basement study into a community room where neighborhood kids could come to read. I donated a portion of the estate to a local clinic in Ethan's name. I made calls to set up a small scholarship in his memory for young nurses who could not afford school, because he would have wanted it, and because it felt like making good on a promise. The public spectacle cooled. The criminal process continued. Indictments, a trial, plea deals. Daniel took a plea. His sentence was proportional and private in the ways these things sometimes are. Patrick fought points in court and eventually reached a settlement that included restitution and a probationary period. The outcomes were imperfect. The law rarely gives the kind of clean ending a story demands, but it gave accountability. One evening, long after the subpoenas and the press, I sat on the back porch and watched the lemon tree. The leaves shimmered silver in the late sun. The house, which had sounded hollow for months, buzzed now with ordinary life. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog, the soft laughter of a child at play in a neighbor's yard. I reached into my pocket and touched the little recorder where Ethan's voicemail still lived. I pressed play. His voice, warm and unguarded, said, "You look after the house." I smiled then, not because I had won in some theatrical sense, but because I had kept my promise. I kept most things quiet in the public recounting. I had learned, painfully, that revenge that is loud often damages the good things left behind. My reward was not spectacle but restoration. The staff who kept their jobs, the garden that thrived, the knowledge that a house that had been loved would remain loved. In the months that followed, Chloe, who had stayed the quiet sibling, visited with photographs of her own child. She sat with me in the kitchen, and we spoke slowly of what family should mean. Simon came by once in the winter, hat in hand, and left a small pot of soup on the doorstep. Margaret and I shared a single awkward dinner where we did not force sentiment, but did not avoid it either. It was tentative, the way two people rearrange a room after a fight. There were temptations to speak the story like a triumph. I resisted. The truth is neither triumph nor tragedy. It is consequence, and consequence has its own kind of mercy. When the last legal paper was signed and the last settlement check cleared, I arranged for a small memorial not for Ethan, but for the life we'd planned, a neighborhood event with lemon bars, hot tea, and the kids from the reading program. We read his recorded words aloud, and all the people who had rallied around me clapped softly as if honoring something fragile. That day, Chloe hugged me in front of a crowd. It was not a cinematic reconciliation. It was a quiet hand on a shoulder that meant, "We will try." When I sit on the porch now and watch the light through the lemon trees, I sometimes think about the small details that carried me. The smell of boiled lemons on Ethan's last autumn day, the texture of Mrs. Alvarez's well-worn hands, the thin rustle of the attic boxes when the van pulled away. Grief taught me vulnerability. The fight taught me that dignity can be defended with patience and facts, not spectacle. If there is one thing I would leave you with, it is this: plan quietly, act clearly, and hold generosity as your compass. People will show you who they are when money enters the room. That is painful, but it is also a kind of truth that lets you choose who stays. If you were Amelia, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have done exactly what I did, waited, watched, and acted when it mattered most? This was after my husband died. His family tried to steal my inheritance, but I was one step ahead. If this story struck something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories of betrayal, justice, and redemption, because sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest revenge. This is true revenge.